Hello and welcome to another Pause for Thought education blog from petcp.com. A particularly nasty, persuasive and destructive piece of advice that's been passing around the dog world for many years now is the idea that you should always ignore a frightened dog, because by cuddling and paying attention to him, you only reinforce that fear and make it worse. For many years now, like many other people working in the pet behaviour industry, I've been challenging this popular behaviourist dogma and reassuring worried owners that, on the contrary, it's really important that they do cuddle and love their dogs when they are frightened and upset. And this idea that it's fine to hug a frightened dog is underpinned by the principle that only behaviours can be reinforced. You can't reinforce an emotion. Now, to me, this kind of implies that emotions aren't really involved here, or at least they play some kind of passive role somewhere there in the background. I've been uncomfortable with the scientific accuracy of this idea that you can't reinforce an emotion for some time now. So in this video blog, I'm going to challenge the science and present to you what I believe is a more accurate and plausible explanation. My central claim is that the following statement is wrong. Only behaviours can be reinforced. You cannot reinforce an emotion. I challenge this statement with what I believe is a more accurate account that, firstly, emotions can be reinforced, and specifically the emotion of fear can be reinforced in fearful dogs. Secondly, and because of the above, the consequences of ignoring your dog when she's frightened is not emotionally neutral. In fact, I believe that it constitutes animal psychological abuse. And to support and back up my claim, I use 5 central arguments, and I'll take some time to unpack these arguments in this video blog. Argument number 1. Outdated learning theory dogma. For me, the last 100 years or so of psychology can be conveniently divided into 4 distinct periods or eras, which I label here as subjective emotional liberalism on the left, objective imperial behaviorism, the social engineering revolution, and finally, on the right-hand side, affective neuroscience liberalism. And actually, it's not only psychology that's changed radically over this 100-year period. There are also cultural shifts too, which I illustrate here with the shifting musical tastes through these periods. The first era here is what I call the period of subjective emotional liberalism. The late 1800s marked the beginning of the end of a great classical era in music that started with Haydn and Mozart, worked its way through Beethoven, and finally fell into the hands of Johannes Brahms, who perfected the classical symphonic form. And this is the music that Charles Darwin and the psychologist William James were listening to. They were also captivated and shocked by the stories that appeared in the press about the infamous Jack the Ripper and his reign of terror and murder in Whitechapel, London between 1888 and 1891. The pendulum of opinion for the Victorians was way over on the left, liberal-minded side about emotions, and not just in humans, but in other animals as well. In 1872, Charles Darwin published his book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, and in 1890, William James published the first great psychology textbook, The Principles of Psychology, where he writes extensively about the importance of emotions. This is also when the great Sigmund Freud was developing his theories on psychoanalysis, which of course was all highly subjective, and all about emotions in his patients, some with serious psychiatric disorders. But the turn of the century saw the dawn of a new age, which I call the era of objective imperial behaviorism, a period that lasted about 30 years. This period was colourfully reflected in the startlingly different musical styles of Ivan Stravinsky and his Rites of Spring. It was modern, it was radical, and it was new. And Ivan Pavlov, John Watson and Fred Skinner were listening to this music as they concocted and perfected their equally radical behaviourist ideology. Of the three, John Watson was by far the most radical of all. At the turn of the century, there was a huge backlash from the broader scientific community, the hard scientists, dominated by physics, astronomy, mathematics, chemistry and geology. They hated Freud and they hated his fluffy psychoanalysis. They hated Darwin with his emotional animals, and they hated James with his subjective descriptions of emotions and emotion theory. Psychology as a scientific discipline was far too vague, fluffy and imprecise to be called real science, and it was broadly dismissed. As a psychologist, John Watson was hugely embarrassed by this, and in the grey box on the right-hand side, I have mapped out some of the hard science Watson felt he was up against. James Clerk Maxwell, the great Scottish physicist, is most famous for his theory of electromagnetism in 1861, where he showed that light was electromagnetic radiation. And his discovery led directly to the invention of the electric motor, which of course opens the door for the Industrial Revolution and brought us to where we are now, with a renewed interest in electric motor technology such as electric cars, electric lorries and even electric aircraft on the horizon. Maxwell's radical new theories also paved the way for both quantum mechanics, which was Max Planck in the 1900s, and Albert Einstein's special theory of relativity in 1905, and then on to Einstein's general theory of relativity and gravity in 1915. Watson was determined to have psychology recognised as a real science, and in 1913 he presented his famous Behaviourist Manifesto, Psychology as the Behaviourist Views It, in a lecture to a packed audience of fellow psychologists and psychiatrists. Watson's Behaviourist Manifesto pulled no punches. In this paper, he challenged his fellow psychologists to throw off the yoke of consciousness, that concerning oneself with such vagaries as consciousness, mind, emotions and feelings had failed psychology as an experimental discipline to make its place in the world as an undisputed natural science. He called upon his colleagues never to use terms like consciousness, mental states, mind and the like, and to concentrate on behaviour only, as only behaviour could be seen, measured and verified. Key point: only behaviours that can be measured matter. Emotions are just irrelevant background neural noise. Behaviour rules. Ivan Pavlov carried out his most famous experiments some years before Watson published his famous Behaviourist Manifesto, and Pavlov's work had a huge influence on Watson's ideas. What Pavlov discovered is that all animals have a basic set of inbuilt or innate reflexes that they are born with, and these reflexes consist of an unconditioned or unlearned response to a corresponding unconditioned or unlearned stimulus. The most famous reflex that everybody knows about is of course the unconditioned salivation reflex, triggered by the unconditioned stimulus of the smell or taste of food. The most important part of Pavlov's discoveries, however, was that other kinds of stimuli that were previously neutral could also be made to trigger these unconditioned responses. And what Pavlov's story tells us in popular science is that just before offering food to his dogs, the unconditioned stimulus for the unconditioned response of salivating, he rang a bell. And he found that very quickly the dogs learned that the bell meant food. He also found that the dogs would readily salivate whenever they heard the sound of the bell alone. The smell or taste of food was no longer necessary to trigger the salivation response. And he called this new, previously neutral stimulus of the sound of the bell the conditioned stimulus. Conditioned because the dogs had learned to associate it with the unconditioned stimulus of the smell and taste of food, and thus trigger the unconditioned response of salivation. Just for the record, Pavlov never actually used a bell, he used a tuning fork, but that's by the by. All dog owners will be well familiar with what Pavlov found, as their dog's reaction to the sound of the food cupboard opening, or the sight and sound of the owner opening up a tin of tasty dog food. Their dog starts to salivate, long before they can actually smell or taste the food that they are about to receive. Two other important reflexes that Pavlov discovered that I need to bring in here in the context of my argument that emotions can indeed be reinforced are the startle reflex and the withdrawal reflex. The startle reflex, of course, is that reflex that causes you to jump if you hear a sudden unexpected sound. And the withdrawal reflex, which is really a pain reflex, is what you see if you touch something hot accidentally and quickly pull your hand away. The startle reflex is again really important because it can be conditioned to be triggered by other previously neutral environmental stimuli. A really common example of this are dogs that become frightened of fireworks. What is important is not the fear of fireworks itself, but the fact that other innocuous sounds, such as the ping of a microwave or the creak of a floorboard, even the sound of a fish tank pump turning on and off, can all be spontaneously conditioned to also trigger the fear response. Unfortunately, this happens automatically, a process called generalization, and this process is almost impossible to prevent. And this explains why there are so many dogs that suffer from fear-related behavioural problems. It's a huge welfare problem for dogs and hugely stressful and upsetting for their owners. Key point: only stimuli and their responses, aka behaviours, are conditioned. Emotions have nothing to do with it. Again, behaviour rules. The third radical behaviourist, standing alongside John Watson and Ivan Pavlov, was of course Fred Skinner, the creator of instrumental or operant learning. What Pavlov told us is that behaviours occurred in response to an innate unlearned stimulus, and that a dog could also learn a similar behaviour linked to a previously neutral stimulus. What Skinner showed us is that dogs could also spontaneously learn new and complex behaviours as a means to obtain the things in life that they want, and also to avoid the things in life that they don't want. Reinforced behaviours are behaviours that are more likely to be repeated in the future. A good example is teaching your dog to do a high five. If you reward her for doing high fives, then she's much more likely to do them for you in the future, hoping to get more food rewards from you, such as treats. Conversely, Skinner also showed that animals could learn to avoid certain other kinds of behaviours, and he called these punished behaviours, simply because they were less likely to be repeated in the future. A good example of this: a dog that has learned to do high fives for treats with you in the kitchen has now unfortunately also become frightened of fireworks. The dog's fear has generalised to also being frightened of the ping sound of the microwave. The dog will no longer perform high fives in the kitchen because that's where the microwave is. In this context, high five behaviour has now been punished. Key point: only behaviours can be reinforced and punished. Emotions are just irrelevant background neural noise. Behaviour rocks. I'm going to pause for a moment here just to give you a quick recap of my 4 eras or 4 periods across my 100-year timeline of psychology. I started with the subjective emotional liberalism of the Victorians, where the pendulum of attitudes towards emotions was way over on the left-hand side. That was followed by my second era of objective imperial behaviourism, with John Watson, Ivan Pavlov and Fred Skinner pulling the pendulum of emotions way over to the right with their stark behaviourist attitudes. Then the 1950s saw the dawn of yet another era, what I call the social engineering revolution. This is a decade after the Second World War. There was more money about, attitudes were shifting again towards the importance of family, the pendulum was swinging over towards the left again, towards softer, more compassionate attitudes about feelings, about emotions. It's no coincidence that the mental illnesses such as anxiety, depression and schizophrenia were now being taken seriously by the medical profession. Musical tastes were changing too. If you saw the 1985 science fiction film Back to the Future, Marty McFly was sent back to 1955. It was the era of rock and roll, championed by Bill Haley and the Crickets with their rock around the clock. I'm going to put this period aside for a moment and come back to it in my second argument. My fourth and final era is what I call the period of effective neuroscience liberalism. We're in the 1990s now, the millennium just around the corner, and Jaak Panksepp, following over a decade of research in emotions in animals, published his seminal book Effective Neuroscience in 1998. The pendulum was again back on the left-hand side. Emotions were indeed important, and what Jaak Panksepp brought to the table was lots of good hard science to prove it. His book was highly controversial and brought much criticism from the wider neuroscience community. And to this day, controversy still remains about what Panksepp had found. The radical music of the time also reflected change. In 1991, Nirvana's tragic frontman Kurt Cobain was yelling out "Smells Like Teen Spirit" on MTV. In his groundbreaking and radical book, Effective Neuroscience, Panksepp catalogued the details of 7 core emotional systems. Just to be clear, in psychology, the term affective means feeling. Feelings are those private, internal, subjective states, good or bad states, that we are all so familiar with, such as joy, happiness, sadness, hunger and thirst, pain, grief, anger, love, disgust, and of course, fear. Panksepp found that running through the core of the brain are 7 core emotional systems, and he named these systems seeking, play, care, lust, rage, fear, and panic grief. And these emotions together form the heart of all emotions, all effects we experience. Now, I'm not going to go into any details here about these core emotional systems. You can find some information about them scattered across my website at www.petcpd.com, and there are many good resources about them you can find online. However, I'm going to talk about some of these emotions here because they are central to my argument that emotions can be reinforced. The core emotions I'm going to discuss are seeking, care, panic grief, and fear. The first thing to notice here is that Panksepp has done away completely with the behaviourist explanation of Pavlov's classical or respondent conditioning and also Skinner's operant or instrumental learning, and he's replaced them both with a single description that effectively combines the two in a single emotion-driven model. So let's unpick this and see what's happening here. Think about this. When you're in a group of people at a party or a crowded place like a theatre or a meeting hall, where there are lots of people chatting with each other, you can hear all the chatter going on in the background, but you don't take much notice of it, you filter it out. But then someone says your name, somewhere over in another group on the other side of the room, and somehow your brain manages to focus on that and call it to your attention. In psychology, this is called the cocktail party effect. And this is basically what the seeking system does. The seeking system is really a seeking expectancy system, or as I prefer to call it, an emotional prediction system. Emotional because it lies at the heart of Panksepp's 6 other core emotional systems. And what this emotional prediction system is doing is gathering in all the sensory stimuli coming in from the environment, all the sights, the sounds, the smells, the touch from people or dogs close to you, and so on and so on. And this system wades through all this sensory data, basically looking for patterns. And when it finds something that might be significant, such as hearing your name, it then tries to make a prediction of what that might mean. The emotion prediction system relies very much on previous learning from environmental stimuli it has experienced before. And it pays special attention to stimuli that have indicated danger in the past, such as fireworks that have frightened the dog before. And if the dog has become conditioned to respond to previously neutral sounds, such as the ping of a microwave through Pavlovian classical conditioning, then the emotion prediction system will pick those noises up too, and the dog will become fearful. The emotion prediction system then determines what the dog does. In other words, it determines the dog's behaviour. If the emotional prediction is correct, then the prediction is reinforced, the emotion is reinforced. If the emotion prediction is wrong, the dog then needs to learn from and update its prediction for the future. The crucial point here is that it is the emotions that are reinforced, not the behaviours. The behaviours that you see are nothing more than the outcome of the dog's predictions. Key point: only emotions can be reinforced, and this is what we call learning. Only emotions strengthen the connections between synapses in the brain. Behaviours do not and cannot do this. Intentional behaviours always follow their emotions. Argument number 2. Outdated social psychology dogma. You'll recall that during my 100 years of psychology that I presented in my first argument, I said that I was going to come back to the third period along that 100-year timeline, which is what I called the social engineering revolution in the 1950s. You'll also recall that I said that this was an era when attitudes were shifting again towards the importance of family. One particular belief in psychology that dated back to John Watson and his work in 1913 was the idea that what created the attachment or the bond between a mother and her baby was that the mother was a provider of resources or food. A lot of John Watson's research was on learning in children, and if you want to get some idea of what he was up to, look up Little Albert on the internet. In the 1950s, social psychologist Harry Harlow set out to challenge this idea. He was not convinced that the reinforcement for the attachment or bond between a mother and her baby was simply as a provider of resources, in this case food. And to find out, he set up a range of experiments that would find answers to 4 important questions. 1. What was the nature of the bond between an infant and mother? 2. How strong was this bond? 3. Was this attachment or bond more important than survival? And 4. What would happen if this bond was broken completely? I need to warn you at this point that Harlow's experiments are highly controversial and deeply upsetting, so you might want to skip this section and move on to my third argument. Some of the work he did would never be allowed today because it would never get past an ethics committee. However, Harlow's work did teach us some profoundly important details about the nature of attachment in social animals. And in 1998, Jaap Panksepp gave us the anatomical details of how it actually worked in the brain. Question 1. What is the nature of the bond between infant and mother? The prevailing belief at the time was that food was the primary reinforcer of the social bond between mother and baby. In all Harlow's experiments, he used baby rhesus monkeys as his subjects, separated from their mothers, to represent human babies. In the first experiment, Harlow gave his infant monkeys a choice of 2 almost identical, very basic, stripped-down surrogate mothers, made of wire and wood. One mother, in the diagram on the left, was just bare wire with a bag of milk and a teat from which the baby could feed. The other mother, on the right, doesn't provide milk, but it is wrapped in a soft blanket instead to represent warmth and comfort. What Harlow found is that the babies would readily feed from the wire-feeding mother on the left, but as soon as they had fed, they would jump back to the soft mother on the right. And as you can see in this diagram, the babies spent about 23 hours of their day clinging and cuddling the soft mother, returning only occasionally to the wire mother when they were hungry. The conclusion was that the nature of attachment was for care, not for food. Question 2. How strong is this care bond between mother and infant? This question goes a step further in trying to find out what care actually means. What Harlow did here was to separate the babies from both mothers by putting them into a box. He then exposed them to a scary mechanical monster thing that he had bought, which was noisy and waved its arms around in front of the babies. You can find video clips of this on YouTube. He then opened the door of the box and watched what the babies did. The infants screamed and ran straight to the cloth mother and clung onto her as tightly as they could. They never ran to the wire feeding mother for safety. And they also stopped going to the wire mother to feed because they were frightened. The conclusion was that the cloth mother represented a secure base where the infants could find safety and security. Question 3. Is this bond more important than survival of the fittest? Essentially, this third experiment was set up to find out how abusive the care mother would have to be so that the care mother was no longer a place of safety and security for the infant. Harlow achieved this by fitting the cloth mother with canisters of compressed air that was randomly and unexpectedly squirted at the infant as it clung to the cloth mother. And what Harlow found was completely unexpected. He thought that he would find a point at which the infants would just stop going to the cloth mother and perhaps go to the wire mother instead, but that never happened. What happened instead is that the infants would get very upset and move off the cloth mother but would then go straight back and immediately cling to her again even more tightly. The more stressed and upset the infants became, the more they tried in desperation to stay clinging to the cloth mother. The conclusion was that the social attachment bond between infant and mother represented love. I'm going to come back to this crucially important finding in my third argument because I need to unpick it further. Harlow's fourth and final question was, what would happen if this bond was broken permanently? The fourth experiment that Harlow did was by far the most controversial of all, and as I said, would never get past an ethics committee today. What he did was to put his infant rhesus monkeys into solitary isolation for periods of up to 2 years. These infants had all the food and warmth to meet their physiological needs. The only thing that was missing was that emotional attachment, that love. What Harlow found was that many of these infants simply died during the course of the experiment. Their death wasn't caused by starvation of food or lack of some physiological need such as warmth or sleep. The conclusion was that their death was caused by starvation of love. Furthermore, the infants that survived were severely emotionally damaged and dysfunctional. For most of the infants, this was permanent. Taken together, Harlow's work tells us a great deal about the nature of social attachment in social animals, including dogs and humans, and I'll come back to this in my third argument. Key point. In 1958, Harlow identified an important social attachment system. In 1998, Panksepp found and named it. Argument number 3. Dogs are a special case. My third argument against the idea that emotions cannot be reinforced is that dogs represent a very special case of social animal. There is a simple reason for this: selective breeding. Over hundreds of years, we have specifically bred dogs and selected those that are sociable and friendly and that form strong, lifelong social attachments to human beings. We have been so successful at this that there are studies that show that even as early as 5 weeks old, puppies start to show a preference to being around and making eye contact with humans, even over their own mothers and other dogs. Puppies are also able to follow the direction of human pointing at just 4 weeks old. This is just after their eyes have opened and they've become mobile. Selective breeding has changed our dogs in other ways too. By selecting dogs that form strong social attachments to humans, this has also made dogs particularly vulnerable to suffering from separation anxiety. Genetic studies have shown polymorphisms or changes in the dog's genetic code, the genes, that control social behaviour, and in particular social attachment. Separation anxiety is the result of forming very strong and well-developed secure social attachments to the dog's human family. There are breed variations. Retriever-type dogs are particularly vulnerable, while so-called ancient breeds or northern breeds, such as Huskies and Akitas, are less vulnerable. And this brings me back to the flowchart I showed you earlier of how Panksepp's seeking system, what I prefer to call the emotion prediction system, actually works. Our dogs have learned that whenever they come to us, we usually reach out and touch them. We acknowledge that they are there, and we often do this without even realizing we're doing it. We have also trained our dogs to come back to us when we call them, and we have encouraged them to come to us for comfort and safety whenever they're worried, upset or confused. Their emotional prediction systems have learnt these rules because that's what we have taught them to do. Dogs form particularly strong and lifelong secure social attachments to their human families. Harry Harlow's third experiment, where he used compressed air to distress and upset the infant rhesus monkeys, showed us what these secure social attachments actually meant. Now let's translate this back to dogs, and in particular, a dog that is frightened of fireworks. How do you think a frightened dog feels when the humans in the house suddenly change the rules and ignore her just when she needs them most? This is why the advice to ignore your dog when she's frightened is so dangerous, because what it does is erode the trust and dependence the dog has on her human family. It is the emotion of fear that is being reinforced here, not the behaviour, and that constitutes animal abuse. Key point: ignoring a frightened dog is cruel and it is animal abuse. Argument number 4. It's not just about fear. In my fourth argument, I'm bringing together some of the factors that I've talked about already. You will recall that in my third argument, I said that dogs are a special case because we have bred them to form strong and lifelong secure social attachments with their human families. And in my second argument, I showed you the work of Harry Harlow and the devastating effects of breaking that secure social attachment bond with the parent figure. The chart here shows you the relationships between Panksepp's fear system, panic grief system and care system. Let me now unpick all this to show you exactly what's going on here. When your dog is frightened, the fear system releases a cocktail of feel-bad chemicals, and she comes to you for reassurance, security and safety. When you pay attention to your dog and love her, the dog's care system is activated and it releases a cocktail of feel-good chemicals that suppress both the panic grief system and the fear system. Conversely, if you ignore your dog when she comes to you for reassurance and safety, this activates the panic grief system and also further activates the fear system, releasing even more feel-bad chemicals into the brain. If your dog already suffers from separation anxiety and she's also fearful of fireworks, this really is an emotionally toxic cocktail for the dog, and you can work out the consequences of that for yourself. There is one other nasty twist I need to show you here. In my second argument, I told you about the devastating effects of separation that Harry Harlow identified in his rhesus monkey infants. And as I showed you, it is Panksepp's panic grief system that is responsible for this. What makes lack of love or grief feel so bad is that the panic grief system hijacks the brain's pain pathways, and I've added this to my chart here. If you think about how grief, loss of a loved one, is expressed in human literature, it comes as no surprise that the metaphors we use are related to pain. Broken hearts, bleeding hearts. Elton John sung about love lies bleeding in the sand. And this connection between the panic grief system and the pain pathways explains why Harlow's baby monkey infants died from lack of love. It was fatal. Key point: fear in dogs is always more than just fear. Other social emotion systems are always engaged too. Hug your dog. Argument number 5. It's about dogs through their lifespans. My fifth and final argument is that, like us humans, dogs are living longer lives. And just like us, that comes with age-related wear and tear. And arthritis is a really common condition in adult dogs. In my first argument, I said that Pavlov's withdrawal reflex was really a pain withdrawal reflex, and emotionally that reflex automatically triggers Panksepp's fear system. So there is a direct link between fear and pain. And a recent study shows us that dogs with chronic pain are more likely to suffer from fear-related behaviour problems. The sting in the tail here is that a sudden noise triggers Pavlov's startle reflex, the dog jumps, and the action of jumping exacerbates the dog's pain. And this is exactly what this study found. So the bottom line here is that if you have a dog that is frightened of noises, please do make sure that your dog is not suffering from pain as well. Key point: always remember coexisting medical conditions in older dogs. Never forget about chronic pain like arthritis. Summing up, I started out with my claim that emotions can indeed be reinforced, and in particular I said that the emotion of fear is reinforced and that ignoring your dog when she comes to you for reassurance and safety is animal abuse. I then presented you with 5 arguments to support my case. Thank you for taking the time to listen and watch this video blog. Love your dogs and they will love you back even more.